Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Close your eyes for a moment. Picture a galaxy stretched thin across the black void of space, burning at both ends with the light of 1 trillion dying stars. Somewhere in the heart of that galaxy sits a throne of gold, and upon that throne rests the broken body of a being who once dared to call himself a man. He built an empire not with words or kindness, but with fire and blood and the sheer unstoppable will of 20 sons forged from his own divine essence, 20 demigods, each one taller than any mortal, stronger than any army, and more brilliant than any mind that had come before them. They were the Primarchs, and they were meant to save humanity. But nothing born in the shadow of the warp ever stays clean for long. Half of those sons fell to the whispers of dark gods. Some were consumed by rage, others by ambition. A few were simply broken by the weight of what they were asked to become. And in the wreckage of their father's dream, each of them proved, as in their own terrible way, just how powerful they truly were. Tonight, we are going to walk through all 18 of the known Primarchs and place them in order, from the least powerful to the most devastatingly, cosmically dangerous among them. We are not counting the 2 lost Primarchs, the 2nd and the 11th, because their records were scoured from every archive in the Imperium, and even the Emperor himself does not speak their names. What little we know of them amounts to rumor and shadow, and ranking a ghost feels a bit unfair to the ones who actually showed up to the fight. Now, before we begin, let me explain how we are measuring power here, because this is one of those conversations that can spiral into friendly arguments that last longer than the siege of terror itself. We are not simply asking who can punch the hardest or who swings the biggest sword, though those things certainly matter. Power, true power, as the kind that reshapes star systems and decides the fate of entire civilizations, is something far more layered than raw muscle. We are looking at combat prowess, certainly. Martial skill, physical strength, speed, the ability to take punishment and keep moving forward when lesser beings would have stopped breathing long ago. But we are also looking at psychic might, because in a universe where the warp bleeds into reality like ink through wet paper, the ability to bend that otherworldly energy to your will is a weapon unlike any other. We are looking at durability, at resilience, at the sheer stubborn refusal to die that some of these brothers displayed across centuries of warfare. We are looking at their demon forms, where applicable, because several of these Primarchs traded their humanity for something far darker and far more potent. And we are considering the totality of their feats across the lore, as the moments where they did something so extraordinary that it was recorded in the annals of the Imperium and whispered about for 10,000 years afterward. This is not a list of who is the best general, though some of these Primarchs were brilliant tacticians. It is not a list of who built the finest empire or wrote the most eloquent poetry. This is a reckoning of raw, devastating, personal power, whilst the kind of power you feel when one of these beings walks onto a battlefield and the very ground seems to tremble beneath their steps. There is something else worth mentioning before we begin, and it is this. Every single one of these beings is, by any reasonable standard, a god walking among mortals. The weakest Primarch on this list could walk through an army of regular human soldiers and emerge on the other side without breaking stride. They could survive in the vacuum of space. They could shrug off wounds that would kill a space marine, who is himself a superhuman warrior capable of feats that would make the mightiest heroes of ancient legend weep with inadequacy. When we talk about ranking these beings from weakest to strongest, we are splitting hairs on the head of divinity itself. The gap between the lowest and highest Primarch is significant, certainly, but it is nothing compared to the gap between any Primarch and the rest of the galaxy's inhabitants. Each Primarch was created using a portion of the Emperor's own genetic material, and each one was designed to embody a different facet of his cosmic capabilities. One received his martial prowess, another received his psychic might, a third received his strategic brilliance, a fourth received his compassion or his fury, or his endurance, or his gift for inspiration. They were fragments of a god, shards of light split through the prism of genetic engineering and scattered across the galaxy by the jealous hands of the Chaos gods, who recognized in these creations the greatest threat to their eternal dominion. When the Emperor found his sons, scattered across dozens of alien worlds, each one had already conquered or united their adopted homeworld. Each one had already proven themselves extraordinary beyond measure. And when they took command of the Space Marine legions that had been created from their genetic template, each one transformed their forces into something that reflected their own personality, their own strengths, their own vision of what war could and should be. The result was 20 unique approaches to the art of destruction, 20 different philosophies of power, and 20 demigods whose relative strength against one another has been debated by fans of this universe for decades. Tonight, yet we are going to settle that debate, or at least we are going to make a very compelling argument for one particular ordering. Whether you agree or disagree, I hope you will find the journey illuminating. So settle in, let the weight of the galaxy press gently against your shoulders, and let us begin at the bottom of this ancient and terrible hierarchy with a son who was never meant to be a warrior at all. Number 18. Lorgar Aurelian, the golden son who knelt before dark gods. In the long and bloody catalogue of the Emperor's sons, there was always one who stood apart from the others, not because he was the strongest or the fastest, or the most cunning on the field of battle, but because he was the one who cared least about battle in the first place. Lorgar Aurelian, Primarch of the 17th Legion, the Word-Bearers, was born with a soul that hungered not for conquest, but for meaning. Where his brothers craved the thunder of war, Lorgar craved the silence of cathedrals. Where they sought the perfect sword strike, he sought the perfect prayer. And this difference, this fundamental misalignment between what Lorgar was and what the Emperor needed him to be, would shape the destiny of the entire galaxy in ways that no one could have predicted. Lorgar landed on the world of Colchis, a planet steeped in religious tradition and ancient worship. He was taken in by a figure named Cor Phaeron, who would become his adoptive father and his spiritual mentor. Under Phaeron's guidance, Lorgar grew into a being of extraordinary charisma and oratorical power. He could move crowds to tears with his words. He could make armies lay down their weapons simply by speaking to them about the divine. He was a prophet, a preacher, and a believer so fierce in his conviction that the ground itself seemed to vibrate with his faith when he spoke. But faith, in the grim darkness of the far future, is a double-edged sword. When the Emperor came to Colchis and claimed Lorgar as his son, the Golden Primarch immediately transferred his devotion to his newfound father. He worshipped the Emperor as a god, built temples in his name, and spread the imperial truth not as secular philosophy, but as divine gospel. His conquests during the Great Crusade were slow, painstaking affairs because Lorgar did not simply conquer worlds, he converted them. Every planet that fell to the Word-Bearers was rebuilt with shrines and cathedrals dedicated to the master of mankind. The Emperor did not want to be worshipped. He had built an empire on the foundation of reason and science, and his son's religious fervor was an embarrassment that threatened to undermine everything the Imperium stood for. So the Emperor sent Rabut Guilliman and the Ultramarines to destroy the perfect city of Monarchia, the jewel of Lorgar's spiritual empire, and forced the entire Word-Bearers Legion to kneel in the ashes of their greatest achievement. It was an act of profound cruelty wrapped in the logic of necessity, and it broke something inside Lorgar that would never be repaired. In terms of pure physical combat, Lorgar was widely acknowledged to be the weakest of all the Primarchs. The lore makes this quite explicit. He did not train with the same obsessive intensity as his brothers, yet he spent his hours in meditation and study, rather than sparring and weapons drill. When matched against another Primarch in a straight fight, Lorgar was at a significant disadvantage. The most famous example of this was his encounter with Corvus Corax at the drop site massacre on Istvan V. Corax, the Primarch of the Raven Guard, caught Lorgar on the battlefield and proceeded to savage him with his lightning claws, Lorgar was cut apart, slashed open, driven to his knees. He would have died right there on the killing fields if his brother Conrad Kurz had not intervened, crashing into Korax and forcing the Ravenlord to disengage. It was a humiliating moment for Lorgar, and it perfectly illustrated where he stood in the martial hierarchy of the Primarchs. But here is where things get complicated, because Lorgar did not stay weak. After his humiliation at Monarchia and his secret pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror, Lorgar became the first Primarch to fully embrace chaos. He opened himself to the ruinous powers with a willingness that shocked even the dark gods themselves, and in return they granted him tremendous psychic ability. Post-pilgrimage, Lorgar was a genuine psyker of frightening potential. He could call upon the warp to fuel devastating attacks, create barriers of psychic energy, and even orchestrate rituals powerful enough to reshape reality itself. But it was Lorgar who performed the ritual that elevated his brother Angron to the status of Daemon Prince, a feat of sorcery so monumental that it required the channeling of raw warp energy on a scale that few beings in the galaxy could have managed. Eventually, Lorgar himself ascended to become a Demon Prince of Chaos Undivided, meaning he was not beholden to any single dark god, but drew power from all four. This is a significant distinction, and because it gave him a flexibility that the mono-god demon Primarchs lacked. In his demon form, Lorgar is considerably more powerful than he was as a mortal, with access to warp powers that could challenge even seasoned demon princes. And yet, even with all of that, Lorgar remains near the bottom of this list. His demon form was defeated by a warp-mutated Corvus Corax in the Eye of Terror. Yes, with Corax dominating the fight so thoroughly that Lorgar was forced to retreat and close the portal behind him. His martial skills, even enhanced by chaos, never reached the level of his more combat-focused brothers. He is dangerous, certainly. A demon Primarch is never something to be taken lightly, but among the company of demigods, Lorgar remains the one who was built for sermons rather than sword fights. His true weapon was always his voice, and his ability to corrupt and inspire and turn the faithful against their own masters. In that arena, he might be the most dangerous of them all. But on the field of individual combat, he sits at the bottom, the golden sun who knelt before dark gods and was still found wanting in the arena of war. There is one more thing worth saying about Lorgar, and it concerns the nature of his contribution to the forces of chaos. While he may be the weakest individual fighter, Lorgar is arguably the most consequential traitor Primarch in terms of his lasting impact on the galaxy. He was the one who first discovered the truth about the Chaos Gods. He was the one who set in motion the corruption of Horus, working through his agents Erebus and Kor Pharaon. He was the one who performed the ritual that turned Angron into a demon prince. And he was the one whose theological framework gave the worship of chaos a structured, organized form that has persisted for 10,000 years. Without Lorgar, the Horus heresy might never have happened. Without his vision and his faith, the forces of chaos would lack the organized religious infrastructure that makes them such a persistent and adaptable threat to the Imperium. He is weak in a fight, yes, but his words have killed more people than any sword ever forged. That is a kind of power too, even if it does not help him when a shadow-wreathed Corvus Corax comes screaming out of the darkness with murder on his mind. Number 17. Alpharius and Omegon, the twin serpents of deception. Now we come to what might be the single most frustrating entry on this list, not because the placement is necessarily wrong, but because everything about these two is wrapped in so many layers of deception and misdirection that establishing definitive facts about them is like trying to hold smoke in your bare hands. Alpharius and Omegon, the twin Primarchs of the 20th Legion, the Alpha Legion, are unique among the Emperor's sons for one simple reason. There were two of them sharing a single destiny. They were the last of the Primarchs to be discovered, which is itself a statement wrapped in uncertainty. Because with the Alpha Legion, even the order of events is subject to dispute. What we do know, or what the lore as reliably as it can be trusted tells us, is that Alpharius and Omegon were physically the smallest of the Primarchs. where most of their brothers stood between 10 and 12 feet tall, towering over even the genetically enhanced space marines who served them. The twins were notably shorter. They were close enough in stature to their own legionaries that they could, and frequently did, disguise themselves as regular Alpha Legion Marines. This was not a weakness, it was perhaps their greatest weapon. Because when anyone could be Alfarius, no one was ever truly safe, and no intelligence about the Alpha Legion could ever be fully trusted. In terms of raw physical combat, Alfarius and Omegon were solidly in the lower tier of Primarch martial ability. They were not built for the kind of straightforward, apocalyptic melee combat that characterized brothers like Angron or Leman Russ. Their strength lay in scheming, in manipulation, in the weaving of plots so intricate that their enemies were often defeated before the first shot was fired. The Alpha Legion did not win wars through brute force. They won through infiltration, sabotage, and the careful dismantling of their opponent's command structures long before the main assault even began. But let us be fair to them. Alfarius, in particular, was no pushover in a fight. He was still a Primarch, which meant he possessed the superhuman strength, speed, and resilience that came standard with the Emperor's genetic template. He could take on entire squads of Space Marines single-handedly and emerge victorious. He was skilled with a variety of weapons and could hold his own against formidable opponents. During the Great Crusade, Alfarius proved himself capable of matching mock combat bouts with Horus Lupercal himself, and while these were training exercises rather than fights to the death, they demonstrated that Alfarius possessed genuine martial talent. The problem is, what happened when the stakes were real? At the Battle of Pluto, during the opening stages of the Solar War, Alfarius led his Alpha Legion in a daring assault on the system's outer defenses. The plan was characteristically ambitious and multi-layered, designed to seize critical intelligence about the Sol system's defense network for Horus's invasion fleet. But Rogel Dawn, the Praetorian of Terror, was waiting for him. Dawn had anticipated the Alpha Legion's infiltration tactics and laid a trap of his own. When Alfarius and Dawn finally met on the battlefield, the fight was brutal and decisive. Dawn killed Alfarius, driving his chainsword through the twin Primarch's chest and ending his existence. Now, the Alpha Legion being what it is, there has been endless debate about whether the Alfarius who died was truly Alfarius, or whether it was actually Omegon wearing his brother's identity, or whether it was some elaborate deception designed to make the Imperium lower its guard. This is the fundamental challenge of ranking the twins. Nothing about them can be taken at face value, but taking the lore at its most reliable interpretation, Alfarius was killed by Dawn in a direct confrontation, which places him firmly in the lower tier of Primarch combat ability. Dawn was a skilled fighter, certainly, but he was not generally considered among the absolute apex of Primarch martial prowess. The fact that he was able to decisively defeat Alfarius suggests that the twin serpent, for all his cunning, lacked the raw combat power to compete with the mid to upper tier brothers. Omegon survived his twin's death, though the severing of their shared psychic bond was described as devastating. After the heresy, the Alpha Legion continued to operate in the shadows, and Omegon may have met his own end at the hands of Rabuta Gilliman on the world of Escrador, though the circumstances of that engagement are characteristically murky. Some accounts say Gilliman killed Alfarius there, which would be chronologically impossible if Alfarius truly died at Pluto. Others suggest it was Omegon using his brother's name, as the twins had done throughout their existence. Well, what we can say with reasonable confidence is that neither twin displayed the kind of overwhelming personal combat ability that would place them higher on this list. Their genius was collective, strategic, and operational. They won wars through intelligence and deception rather than individual might. In a universe where power is often measured in how many enemies you can personally destroy in a single engagement, the Alpha Legion approach, while devastatingly effective on a macro scale, does not translate into high placement on a personal power ranking. The serpent is cunning, but when cornered and forced to fight without its schemes, it is still just a serpent. What makes the twins so fascinating from a power ranking perspective is not their individual combat ability, but the philosophical question they raise about the nature of strength. Is a being who can manipulate entire wars from the shadows, who can turn enemies against each other without ever drawing a weapon, or who can make an entire galaxy question whether up is really up and down is really down, truly less powerful than a brother who can swing a bigger sword? In the framework we are using tonight, where personal combat power is the primary metric, the answer is yes. Alpharius and Omegon sit near the bottom because their genius was collective and strategic rather than individual and martial. But there is a version of this ranking, one that weighs influence and operational impact over personal killing power, where the twin serpents would slither much closer to the top. One final note on the twins. Their legion, the Alpha Legion, remains one of the most active and dangerous forces in the current era of the 41st millennium, 10,000 years after the heresy. They have survived without their Primarch or Primarchs for longer than almost any other traitor force, and they continue to wage their shadow war against the Imperium with a persistence and adaptability that suggests their creator's genius has been deeply imprinted into the Legion's institutional memory. The Hydra has many heads, and cutting one off has never been enough to kill it. Number 16. Ferrus Manus, the Gorgon, whose hands were silver and whose death was bronze. There is a particular cruelty in speaking about Ferrus Manus, the Primarch of the 10th Legion, the Iron Hands. Because to talk about him is to talk about potential that was violently and permanently cut short. Among all the Primarchs, Ferrus is the one who died earliest and most definitively, his head taken from his shoulders by the demon-possessed blade of his closest brother, Fulgrim, on the killing fields of Istvan V. It was a death that echoed through the millennia, a wound in the soul of the Imperium that never truly healed. And it means that any assessment of Ferrus Manus must grapple with the uncomfortable reality that we are ranking a warrior who never got the chance to reach his full potential. What we know of Ferrus before his death paints the picture of a Primarch who was genuinely among the most physically impressive of the Emperor's sons. He landed on the world of Medusa, a harsh and unforgiving planet of perpetual volcanic activity and shifting tectonic plates. The people of Medusa were hardy survivors, metalworkers and craftsmen who had learned to endure in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. Ferrus thrived in this environment. He grew into a being of tremendous physical power, with a particular gift for metallurgy and craftsmanship that set him apart even among his superhuman brothers. The most famous legend associated with Ferrus Manus involves his encounter with a creature known as the Silver Worm, in a being variously described as a Necron construct or some other ancient Xenos entity of extraordinary durability. According to the accounts, Ferrus wrestled the creature for 3 consecutive days, eventually dragging it into a river of molten lava and drowning it beneath the liquid rock. When he emerged from that ordeal, his hands and forearms had been coated in the creature's living metal, giving them a silvery metallic sheen that became his most recognizable feature. But these silver hands were not merely cosmetic. They granted Ferrus an additional layer of durability and strength that made his already formidable physical capabilities even more impressive. In terms of raw physical strength, Ferrus was consistently regarded as one of the most powerful of the Primarchs. Some sources place him at the very top in terms of pure muscle power, above even Vulcan and Angron. He could lift massive slabs of rock for hours without fatigue. Yet he could forge weapons with his bare hands that lesser artisans would need entire workshops to produce. He was a walking forge, a being whose connection to metal and machinery was so profound that it seemed almost spiritual. But physical strength alone does not determine placement on this list, and Ferrus Manus had notable limitations that keep him in the lower half. His martial skill, while certainly formidable, was not at the level of the truly elite Primarch duelists. The evidence for this comes from his final battle with Fulgrim. The two brothers had been close friends during the Great Crusade, bonded by their shared love of craftsmanship and artistic perfection. When Fulgrim fell to the corruption of the Leia blade and the whispers of Slaanesh, he turned against his brother at the Dropsite massacre. Their duel was a tragedy in every sense. Ferrus fought with fury and determination, but Fulgrim, enhanced by the demon within his blade and his own considerable martial skill, gained the upper hand. Some accounts suggest that Ferrus might have had a momentary advantage when he shattered Fulgrim's demon weapon, but the resulting psychic explosion stunned him more than it did Fulgrim, and the Emperor's children Primarch was able to recover first and deliver the killing blow. There are those who argue that Ferrus hesitated at a crucial moment, unwilling to truly kill the brother he loved. This is a fair point, and it introduces an element of uncertainty into the assessment. Would Ferrus have won if he had fought without restraint? If he had treated Fulgrim as an enemy from the first exchange of blows, rather than a brother who might still be saved? We will never know, and that is the tragedy of Ferrus Manus. And his death at Istvan V froze him in the lore as a Primarch of enormous physical potential, but relatively limited demonstrated feats compared to brothers who survived the heresy and went on to accumulate centuries of additional combat experience. He never ascended to become a demon. He never unlocked latent psychic abilities. He never evolved beyond what he was at the moment of his death. He was the Gorgon, a titan of metal and muscle, and he fell because the universe does not always reward strength alone. Robert Gilliman himself once named Ferrus among what he called the Dauntless Few, a select group of brothers he considered the finest warriors. That speaks volumes about what Ferrus might have become if fate had been kinder. But fate was not kind, and the Gorgon's story ended with his head in his brother's hands, a monument to the idea that even the mightiest can fall when betrayal comes from those they love most. The legacy of Ferrus Manus lives on in his Iron Hands chapter, who took their father's death as a philosophical lesson about the weakness of flesh. They have become increasingly cybernetic over the millennia, replacing more and more of their organic bodies with mechanical augmentation in a belief that the flesh is weak and only the machine endures. It is a bitter irony, because Ferrus himself had come to understand in the years before his death that his silver hands were not a blessing, but a reminder that there were forces in the universe that could alter even a Primarch against his will. He had begun to contemplate having the living metal removed, to return to his original flesh and blood form. That contemplation ended on the killing fields of Istvan V, and his sons inherited a lesson about the weakness of flesh from a father who was on the verge of learning that flesh was not the weakness they thought it was. And it is also worth noting that Perturabo, the Lord of Iron, took Ferrus's legendary Warhammer Forgebreaker as a trophy after the massacre and has wielded it ever since. There is something deeply unsettling about a brother carrying the weapon of a sibling he helped murder, using the craftsmanship of the dead against the living. It speaks to the particular cruelty of the heresy, where the bonds of brotherhood were not merely broken, but weaponized. Number 15. Corvus Corax, the Shadow Lord who became something more. Corvus Corax, the Primarch of the 19th Legion, the Raven Guard, is one of those figures who defies easy classification because his story spans two very different eras of power. During the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy, Corax was generally considered to be among the less physically imposing Primarchs in terms of direct combat capability. He was not a frontline brawler like Angron or a precision duelist like Fulgrim. His strength lay in stealth, in speed, in the ability to strike from shadow and vanish before his enemies could mount a meaningful response. He was a knife in the dark rather than a hammer on the anvil, and while that made him extraordinarily effective in his chosen mode of warfare, it also meant that in a straight-up fight against a more combat-oriented brother, Corax was at a disadvantage. The evidence for this comes primarily from the events of the Dropsite Massacre, where Corax fought alongside Ferrus Manus and Vulcan against the traitor legions. When the battle turned against the Loyalists and the trap was sprung, Corax found himself in desperate combat against overwhelming odds. He engaged Lorgar, the weakest of the Primarchs in martial terms, and absolutely destroyed him in the encounter, his lightning claws tearing through Lorgar's armor and flesh with predatory efficiency. But when Conrad Kersey arrived to save Lorgar, Corax was forced to disengage. This was a tactical decision, rather than a reflection of Corax being unable to fight Kurzi. The Raven Lord recognized that he was being drawn into an engagement he could not win while surrounded by enemies on all sides. Still, it established a pattern where Corax's combat effectiveness was highest against weaker opponents and in situations where he could control the terms of engagement. During the Great Crusade, when Corax had reportedly been an even match for Horus in mock combat and wrestling bouts, which is a significant statement given Horus's reputation as one of the finest warriors among the Primarchs. But these were practice sessions, and the gap between training and a real fight to the death is often the gap between life and oblivion. What elevates Corax above Ferrus and the lower-ranked Primarchs is what happened to him after the heresy. Consumed by grief and rage over the loss of his legion at Istvan, Corax eventually disappeared from the Imperium, venturing alone into the Eye of Terror to hunt traitor Primarchs. And somewhere in that nightmarish realm of corrupted space, something happened to him. The warp changed Corax, or perhaps it revealed something that had always been lurking within his genetic code. He became a creature of living shadow, or a being of darkness so profound that even the demons of the warp feared his approach. In this transformed state, Corax encountered the demon Primarch Lorgar on a word-bearer's demon world and engaged him in combat. The result was decisive. Corax dominated the fight, forcing Lorgar to retreat and seal the portal behind him in desperation. A loyalist Primarch, transformed by the warp into something that could defeat a demon prince in his own domain. That is a feat of extraordinary significance. And it suggests that Corax, in his current state, has transcended the limitations that once placed him in the lower tier of Primarch combat ability. The question is, how much weight to give to this transformation when assessing his overall power level. Corax's warp shadow form is undeniably more powerful than his original mortal body, but the details of its capabilities are still relatively sparse in the lore. We know he can become intangible, blending with darkness in a way that goes beyond mere stealth and into something approaching manipulation of reality itself. We know he can hurt demon Primarchs, which puts him in rarefied company. But without more extensive feats to draw from, it is difficult to place him higher than this. Corvus Corax sits in the middle of a transformation from skilled but limited Primarch to something genuinely terrifying. If the lore continues to develop his shadow form and give him additional feats, yes, he could easily climb this list. But for now, he occupies a fascinating liminal space. The Primarch, who was not quite enough in the mortal realm, but is becoming something beyond measure in the realm of darkness. Number 14. Mortarion, the Death Lord who traded one slavery for another. Mortarion, the Primarch of the 14th Legion, the Death Guard, is a being defined by a single, bitter irony. The thing he hated most in all of existence is the thing he eventually became. Born on the toxic death world of Barbarous, a planet shrouded in poisonous fog and ruled by cruel alien overlords who wielded sorcery and warpcraft, Mortarion grew up despising Psykers and everything associated with the Imperium. He climbed the poison-wreathed mountains of his homeworld with nothing but his own strength and endurance, each ascent taking him closer to the alien masters who ruled from above the toxic clouds. It was a childhood of suffering and determination, and it forged Mortarion into perhaps the single most resilient Primarch in terms of pure physical endurance. He could survive toxins that would kill any other being. He could march through environments so hostile that even his superhuman brothers would have faltered. His body was a fortress of resistance, hardened against every form of chemical and biological assault that the universe could throw at him. This was his defining trait, his gift and his curse in equal measure. As Mortarion did not fight like a duelist or a berserker. He fought like a siege weapon made of flesh, advancing slowly and inexorably through whatever punishment the enemy could deliver, absorbing blows that would have felled lesser warriors, and continuing forward until his great scythe, Silence, found its mark. In terms of pre-heresy combat ability, Mortarion was generally considered to be in the middle tier of Primarch martial prowess. He was tough, incredibly so, But toughness alone does not win duels against brothers who are both tough and faster, or tough and more skilled with a blade. His encounters with Jagatai Khan illustrate this dynamic perfectly. During the heresy, Mortarion and the Khan clashed repeatedly, and their rivalry became one of the defining personal conflicts of the war. In their early encounters, Mortarion's durability allowed him to weather the Khan's lightning-fast attacks, but he struggled to land decisive blows against the faster Primarch. After his fall to chaos and his ascension to Demon Prince of Nurgle, Mortarion became something dramatically more powerful. The Plague God's gifts amplified everything that Mortarion already was. His already legendary endurance became effectively limitless. His body now radiated clouds of toxic vapor and plague flies that could incapacitate or kill anything that came too close. His great scythe. Silence was imbued with the concentrated essence of every disease that Nurgle had ever dreamed into existence, and a single scratch from its blade could introduce poisons potent enough to bring another Primarch to their knees. He grew moth-like wings that allowed him flight, adding mobility to his already formidable defensive capabilities. During the Siege of Terra, Demon Mortarion faced Jagatai Khan once again, and this time the balance of power had shifted dramatically. But the Khan, still in his mortal form, was brutally beaten down by Mortarion's enhanced strength and demonic endurance. It seemed as though the Death Lord would finally claim victory over his most persistent rival. But the Khan found a crack in Mortarion's armor, not a physical weakness, but a psychological one. He taunted Mortarion, reminding him that the Death Lord had become the very thing he had always despised, a slave to sorcery and dark powers. This enraged Mortarion, and in his fury he became sloppy, allowing the Khan to launch a devastating counterattack that drove the Demon Primarch back. In the current era of the 41st Millennium, Mortarion has continued to be a major threat. He clashed with Reboot Guilliman during the Plague Wars in the Ultramar region, and their confrontation demonstrated that a Demon Primarch, even one who is not among the most martially skilled, represents a threat of cosmic proportions. Guilliman, now armed with the Emperor's sword, one of the most powerful weapons in the entire Imperium, was still hard-pressed against Mortarion's relentless assault. But Mortarion's limitations are real. He is slow, both physically and tactically. His fighting style relies on attrition rather than decisive strikes, which means that opponents who can find ways to bypass his defenses or exploit his emotional vulnerabilities can gain advantages that his raw power cannot overcome. He is powerful. Undeniably so, but he is not the most powerful of the Demon Primarchs, and his mortal form was solidly middle of the pack among the Emperor's sons. Number 13. Reboot Guilliman, the avenging son who carries the weight of an empire. There is a common misconception about Reboot Guilliman, the Primarch of the 13th Legion, the Ultramarines, that needs to be addressed before we go any further. Many people assume that because Guilliman is primarily known as an administrator, a logistician, and a builder of civilizations, he must therefore be weak in combat. This is not true. Guilliman was never the weakest fighter among the Primarchs. He was solidly in the middle tier, a generalist who could hold his own against most of his brothers, even if he lacked the specific advantages that made the upper-tier fighters so devastating. Guilliman himself was reportedly aware of his place in the hierarchy. The lore tells us that he believed only 4 or 5 of his brothers could reliably best him in single combat, while he could defeat the rest. This is a remarkably honest self-assessment for a Primarch, and it places Guilliman firmly in the upper middle of the pack in terms of pure fighting ability. He was not a specialist. He did not have Angron's berserk fury, Sanguinius's preternatural grace, or Fulgrim's blade mastery. What he had was competence in every area and excellence in the broader art of war. During the Great Crusade, Guilliman demonstrated his combat capabilities on numerous occasions. At the Battle of Calth, when the Word-Bearers ambushed the Ultramarines, Guilliman fought several Word-Bearers in the void of space without a helmet. Let that sink in for a moment. He was sucked out of his ship's hull breach and found himself fighting transhuman warriors in hard vacuum, with no helmet, and he survived. More than survived. He fought back to his ship and later confronted Cor Phaeron. the Wordbearer's commander, who had been granted demonic powers by the Chaos Gods. Despite Cor Phaeron's attempts to corrupt him using the same dark persuasion that had turned so many others, Guilliman rejected chaos and literally tore one of Cor Phaeron's hearts out of his chest. That is not the action of a weak warrior. During the heresy, Guilliman faced both Lorgar and Angron in combat. Against Lorgar, yet he held his own reasonably well, the two brothers trading devastating blows until Angron joined the fight.
Now, real quick, I just want to throw in my own 2 cents here because I've been sitting with this list for a while, and honestly, the hardest part wasn't figuring out who goes at the top or the bottom. That's pretty straightforward. The part that kept me up was the middle. Like, guys like Khan, Vulcan, and Kurzay, they're so close in terms of what they can actually do on the battlefield that you could shuffle them around and make a solid argument for any order. And I know some of you are already typing in the comments that I put your favorite too low or too high, and honestly, I get it. That's the fun of it. But if there's one take I'll die on, is that the Khan is criminally underrated. A mortal Primarch talking trash to a demon prince and then beating him because of it? Hey, that's the coldest thing in the entire heresy. But anyway, let's go back to the list now.
Against Angron, Guilliman was clearly overmatched in terms of raw aggression and combat speed. Angron was a gladiator, born and bred for killing. And in a purely physical confrontation, he was simply too fast and too savage for the more methodical Guilliman to handle. The addition of Lorgar made the fight effectively unwinnable, and Guilliman was forced to withdraw. While what makes Guilliman particularly relevant in the current era is the Emperor's Sword, the legendary weapon he now wields after his resurrection by the combined efforts of the Tech Priest, Belisarius Cawl, and the Aeldari prophetess, Yvraine. This blade is not merely an exceptionally crafted weapon. It is said to carry a portion of the Emperor's own psychic might, and it has demonstrated the ability to destroy beings that are otherwise immune to conventional harm. Greater demons that would shrug off entire salvos of weapons fire are cut apart by this sword like parchment. When Guilliman faced the demon Primarch Mortarion during the Plague Wars, the Emperor's sword was the decisive factor that allowed him to drive back a being of cosmic power. Guilliman also confronted the Daemon Primarch Magnus the Red in combat, and while he was outmatched by Magnus's immense psychic abilities, the Emperor's sword again proved to be a potent equalizer. He took hits from Magnus that would have killed lesser beings several times over and kept fighting, demonstrating the kind of grim, unyielding determination that has always been his defining characteristic. In terms of overall power, Guilliman in his current state is significantly more dangerous than he was during the heresy, largely because of his war gear. The armor of fate, reforged by Cawl's genius, provides protection that approaches the absurd even by Primarch standards. And the Emperor's sword transforms him from a capable but unremarkable combatant into a being who can threaten demon Primarchs on roughly even terms. Strip away the sword and the armor, and Guilliman drops several places on this list. But we are ranking Primarchs as they are, with their full capabilities, and the avenging son of Ultramar is carrying some of the most potent weaponry in the entire setting. He is not the most powerful Primarch. He knows this, but he is the one who showed up. He is the one who came back from the dead and took the shattered remnants of his father's empire and held them together through sheer force of will and administrative genius. And when the darkness closes in and the demons howl at the gates, he picks up that burning sword and he fights. That counts for something. That counts for quite a lot. Number 12, Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter who saw every death but his own. Conrad Kurzi, the Primarch of the 8th Legion, the Night Lords. He was not the strongest of the Emperor's sons. He was not the fastest, or the toughest, or the most skilled with a blade. But he might have been the most dangerous, and there is a distinction between those two concepts that is important to understand. Strength is the ability to destroy your enemy. Danger is the ability to make your enemy believe they are already dead before the first blow falls. Kurzi was a master of the second art, and in a universe where morale, psychology, and the will to fight are often more decisive than raw firepower, that mastery made him genuinely terrifying. Kersey landed on the world of Nostramo, a lightless hive planet sunk in perpetual darkness and ruled by criminal overlords who maintained their power through violence and fear. There were no loving foster parents waiting for him, no wise mentors to guide his development. The infant Primarch was alone in the worst place in the galaxy, and he survived by becoming the thing that the darkness feared most. From his earliest days, Kersey possessed a unique and tormented gift: precognitive visions. He could see the future, or at least possible futures, in vivid, agonizing detail. Most of these visions centered on death, destruction, and the worst that humanity was capable of. They showed him a galaxy drowning in blood and horror, and they broke something in his mind that was never repaired. On Nostramo, Kers became the Night Haunter, a figure of absolute terror who maintained order not through law or justice, but through the certainty of horrific punishment. He skinned criminals alive and hung their remains from the towers of the hive cities. He tore apart entire gangs with his bare hands, leaving tableaus of such extreme violence that the population of Nostramo was eventually cowed into obedience through pure, primal fear. It was governance through nightmare, and it worked with a brutal efficiency that even his brothers could not deny. In terms of combat ability, Kersey was genuinely formidable and consistently underestimated. His fighting style was unpredictable, savage, and augmented by his precognitive abilities. He could see attacks before they were launched, anticipate movements before they were made, and position himself in ways that turned his enemies' strengths against them. Now, this made him an exceptionally difficult opponent for even the most skilled of his brothers. The evidence for this is significant. During the Heresy, Kersey simultaneously fought both Lion L. Johnson and Reboot Guilliman, two of the most capable Primarchs in terms of overall combat ability, and he held his own. He did not win definitively, but the fact that he could engage two Primarchs at once without being immediately overwhelmed speaks volumes about his fighting prowess. He later fought Sanguinius, widely regarded as one of the finest warriors among all the Primarchs, and the two were described as being evenly matched, their precognitive abilities cancelling each other out in a duel that neither could gain a lasting advantage in. He also attacked Rogel Dawn, savaging the Praetorian of Terror so badly that Dawn was found unconscious and bleeding with great gouges of flesh torn from his torso. When the Lion eventually cornered Kersey in a one-on-one fight, chas the Dark Angels, Primarch did defeat him, breaking his spine and bringing him to justice. But even this victory was hard-fought, and Kersey had inflicted serious injuries on the Lion before being brought down. It took one of the finest warrior Primarchs to defeat Kersey in single combat, and even then it was not easy. Kersey's weakness was not physical, but psychological. His visions tormented him constantly, and he frequently acted against his own interests because he believed he had seen the future, and it could not be changed. He let an Imperial assassin kill him because his visions told him it was his fate, and he wanted to prove a point about the nature of justice and destiny. This fatalism limited his potential in ways that are hard to quantify. A Kersey who was psychologically whole, who used his precognitive abilities with cold rationality rather than self-destructive fatalism, might have been one of the most dangerous beings in the entire galaxy. As it was, Konrad Curze was a nightmare given flesh, a Primarch whose power was amplified by terror and the ability to see what was coming before it arrived. He sits in the middle of this list because his combat feats place him solidly above the lower-tier fighters, but his lack of warp enhancement, his mortal limitations, and his ultimate willingness to die prevent him from climbing higher. The death of Konrad Curze is, in its own way, one of the most powerful statements any Primarch ever made. He allowed an Imperial assassin, a mortal operative named Meshen, to find him and kill him, because his visions had shown him this death and he believed it proved his point. That justice and vengeance are the same thing, that the Emperor's way was no better than his own, and that the entire Imperium was built on the same foundation of terror and violence that Kersey had used to rule Nostramo. He did not fight, while he did not resist. He simply sat in his throne and let the blade fall, and in dying he proved at least to himself, that everything he had ever believed about the nature of the universe was true. It was a mad act, a final defiance from a broken mind. But there was a terrible logic to it that has haunted the Imperium ever since. If a Primarch, one of the Emperor's own sons, Ono could look at the galaxy his father had built and decide that it was no better than the nightmare he had created on Nostramo, what does that say about the empire that still stands in the Emperor's name? Kurz's death was not a defeat, it was an accusation, and 10,000 years later, the Imperium still has no answer for it. Number 11. Perturabo, the Lord of Iron, whose bitterness was his greatest weapon. Perturabo, the Primarch of the 4th Legion, the Iron Warriors. He is perhaps the most underappreciated combatant among the Emperor's sons, and it is his own fault that this is the case. Throughout the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy, Perturabo was consistently overshadowed by brothers with more dramatic fighting styles or more romantic legends. He was not flashy. He did not engage in the kind of legendary duels that created epic stories. He ground his enemies down with relentless mathematical precision, reducing their fortresses to rubble and their armies to statistical irrelevancies. And because siege warfare lacks the personal drama of a blade fight between demigods, Perturabo's genuine combat capabilities were often overlooked. This was a mistake. Perturabo was a deeply capable warrior in individual combat, with physical strength that placed him among the upper tier of Primarchs. He was massive, even by the standards of his superhuman brothers, and his body was further augmented by the mechanized armor system known as the Logos, which integrated directly with his nervous system and provided additional strength, targeting capabilities, and defensive systems that made him something between a warrior and a walking war machine. The most significant combat feat attributed to Perturabo during the Heresy involves something genuinely extraordinary. He fought and defeated Demon Prince Angron. During the events described in the novel Slaves to Darkness, when the traitor Primarchs were gathering their strength for the final push toward Terra, Angron, already ascended to demonhood and swollen with the rage-fueled power of Horn, challenged Perturabo. The Iron Warrior met that challenge and defeated the Demon Primarch through a combination of tactical intelligence, raw physical power, and the willingness to take tremendous punishment in order to deliver decisive blows, defeating a demon. Primarch in single combat is a feat that very few beings in the Warhammer universe can claim, and it should permanently put to rest any notion that Perturabo was a second-rate fighter. He also killed the clone of Fulgrim during the same period, demonstrating that his killing ability was not limited to a single fortunate encounter. And during the Siege of Terra itself, Perturabo served as the master architect of the assault, and his genius for siegecraft directing the destruction of defenses that Rogel Dawn had spent years constructing. While this is a strategic rather than personal combat feat, it demonstrates the totality of Perturabo's capabilities as a weapon of war. Perturabo eventually ascended to become a demon prince of chaos undivided, though the lore on his demon form is less extensively detailed than that of some of his brothers. Yet what we do know suggests that his ascension amplified his already considerable physical abilities while adding the resilience and warp-derived powers that come standard with demonhood. His precise ranking among the demon Primarchs is debatable, but his mortal form was already capable of feats that most demon Primarchs would be hard-pressed to match. The Lord of Iron's greatest limitation was always himself, his bitterness, his jealousy toward Rogel Dawn, and his conviction that his talents were never properly recognized drove him to make decisions that undercut his own effectiveness. But in terms of raw personal power, Perturabo was a siege engine with a soul, and the results he achieved on both the strategic and personal combat scales place him solidly in the upper middle tier of Primarch power. There is something deeply human about Perturabo's bitterness, which is perhaps why he resonates with so many fans of the setting despite being a traitor. He was the brother who always did the hard, unglamorous work. He was sent to the worst war zones, given the ugliest assignments, and expected to complete them without complaint, while brothers like Horus and Sanguinius received the glory and the praise. He ground through attritional sieges that cost his legion enormous casualties. And when the fighting was done and the fortress was rubble, no one thanked him. No one built monuments to the Iron Warrior who broke the walls. They built monuments to the Golden Sun who led the final charge through the breach. This resentment metastasized into something toxic, a conviction that the entire universe was arranged to deny him the recognition he deserved. It drove him to decimate his own legion as punishment for perceived failures, to murder the population of his homeworld Olympia when they rebelled against imperial rule, and ultimately to join Horus's rebellion not out of any love for chaos, but out of a desire to tear down the system that had, in his eyes, consistently undervalued him. And yet, stripped of all that bitterness, all that jealousy, Perturabo's actual capabilities are extraordinary. He is one of the few Primarchs who can legitimately claim to have defeated a demon prince in single combat while still in his mortal form. That alone should place him in any serious conversation about the most powerful brothers. The fact that it is so often overlooked is perhaps the final, darkest irony of Perturabo's existence. Even in discussions about power, the Lord of Iron is underrated. Number 10. Rogel Dawn, the Praetorian whose walls never truly fell. Rogel Dawn, the Primarch of the 7th Legion, the Imperial Fists, what was the embodiment of a particular kind of strength that is easy to overlook in a universe that rewards aggression and spectacle. He was not the fastest. He was not the most aggressive. He did not fight with the wild abandon that made brothers like Angron or Leman Russ so terrifying on the battlefield. What Dawn possessed was something quieter but no less formidable. He was unmovable. He was the wall that would not break. He was the foundation upon which the defense of an entire empire was built. And when the darkness came to terror, and the War Master's legions hammered at the gates of the Imperial Palace, it was Rogel Dawn who held the line. In terms of physical capability, Dawn was solidly upper tier among the Primarchs. He possessed enormous strength, exceptional endurance, and a fighting style that was as practical and unadorned as the fortifications he was famous for building. He did not seek beauty in combat. He sought efficiency. Every movement was calculated to achieve maximum effect with minimum wasted energy, and this made him an opponent who was extraordinarily difficult to overcome through attrition. Dawn's most notable direct combat achievement was the killing of Alpharius during the Battle of Pluto. This fight was a decisive engagement between two Primarchs, and Dawn emerged victorious through a combination of superior martial skill and his ability to anticipate and counter the Alpha Legion's typically deceptive tactics. He effectively outthought the Master of Deception and then overpowered him in direct combat, which is a statement about both his intellectual and physical capabilities. During the Heresy, Dawn was the architect of the defense of Terra itself. He redesigned the Imperial Palace into the greatest fortress the galaxy had ever seen, layering defenses so deep and so intricately connected that even Perturabo's genius struggled to unravel them. While this is a strategic achievement, it reflects Dawn's overall approach to power, methodical, thorough, and virtually impregnable when he sets his mind to holding a position. In personal combat during the siege, Dawn fought with the kind of grim determination that characterized everything he did. He was wounded, exhausted, but pushed to the absolute limits of even a Primarch's legendary endurance, and he kept fighting. When the Emperor launched his final teleport assault on the vengeful spirit, Dawn was one of the warriors who went with him, standing alongside the Master of Mankind and Sanguinius for what everyone believed would be their last battle. Dawn's eventual fate is uncertain. After the Heresy, he led the Imperial Fists in the Great Scouring and later vanished during a Black Crusade, with only his skeletal hand recovered. The prophetic visions of Conrad Kersey suggested that Dawn was killed, described as being dragged down by 100 murderers in a dark tunnel. But the absence of definitive confirmation leaves the door open for his return, and the Warhammer universe loves to leave such doors ajar. What places Dawn at number 10 rather than higher is the same quality that made him so effective in defense. His fighting style lacked the explosive, a devastating peak power that characterized the upper tier. He was consistent, reliable, and nearly impossible to break. But against the truly elite Primarch fighters, those who combined raw power with supernatural abilities or berserker fury, Dawn's methodical approach could be overwhelmed. He was the immovable object, but several of his brothers were irresistible forces. And when those two concepts collide, the outcome depends on factors that go beyond simple combat skill. Number 9. Fulgrim, the Phoenician whose perfection became corruption. Fulgrim, the Primarch of the 3rd Legion, the Emperor's Children, was built for beauty. In a brotherhood of warriors where function typically trumped form, Fulgrim was the exception, a being of such grace and physical perfection that even his brothers could not help but admire him. He was tall and elegant, with features that seemed to have been sculpted by an artist rather than grown in a laboratory. His movements were fluid and precise, every gesture carrying an economy of motion that made even the simple act of walking look like a performance. And when he fought, that aesthetic sensibility transformed into something genuinely lethal. In terms of pure swordsmanship, Fulgrim was widely regarded as one of the finest blade fighters among all the Primarchs. He and Jagatai Khan were frequently compared as the two preeminent swordsmen of their brotherhood, with Fulgrim favoring an elegant, technical style that emphasized precision and speed over brute force. He was fast, devastatingly so, with reflexes that allowed him to react to threats that would overwhelm slower fighters. His mastery of the blade was not merely physical, but intellectual, a deep understanding of timing, distance, and the psychology of combat that made him a nightmare opponent in a duel. The evidence for Fulgrim's skill is extensive. During the Great Crusade, he defeated a Wraithlord, one of the Aeldari's most formidable war constructs, in personal combat using nothing but his bare hands. This is a staggering feat. Wraithlords are heavily armored ghost warriors that tower over even space marines, and destroying one without weapons requires a level of physical power and fighting skill that beggars belief. He also fought his brother Ferrus Manus in their tragic duel at Istvan V, and ultimately decapitating the Iron Hands Primarch in a fight that saw both brothers push each other to their absolute limits. But Fulgrim's story is not merely one of skill. It is a story of corruption, of perfection pursued so obsessively that it curved back upon itself and became something monstrous. The Leia blade, a demon weapon he claimed as a trophy, slowly corrupted his mind, opening him to the influence of Slanesh, the chaos god of excess and sensation. As the corruption deepened, Fulgrim's already formidable abilities were amplified by the dark power flowing through him, but at the cost of his sanity and his soul. After fully giving himself to Slanesh, Fulgrim ascended to become a demon prince, and his form changed dramatically. No longer the perfectly proportioned warrior of the Crusade, he became a serpentine creature of immense size, multi-limbed and grotesque in a way that was simultaneously horrifying and hauntingly beautiful. In this form, Fulgrim possesses the tremendous physical power and warp-derived abilities that come with demonhood, including the standard immortality and regeneration of a demon prince. However, there is an interesting contradiction in Fulgrim's post-ascension combat record. During the Siege of Terra, Demon Fulgrim engaged Rogel Dawn in combat and was described as struggling against the Imperial Fist's Primarch. Was a result that was surprising, given Fulgrim's reputation as one of the finest fighters among the brothers. Some interpret this as evidence that Fulgrim's transformation, while granting him power, also robbed him of some of the precise martial skill that had defined his fighting style. A four-armed serpent creature, however powerful, does not fight the same way as a perfectly balanced humanoid swordsman. After the heresy, Fulgrim mortally wounded Reboot Guilliman at the Battle of Thessala, delivering a cut that left the Ultramarines Primarch in stasis for 10,000 years. In the current setting, he has re-emerged as an active threat, and his return as a Daemon Primarch represents one of the more significant dangers facing the Imperium. But among the Daemon Primarchs, Fulgrim's combat record is somewhat uneven, with moments of brilliance offset by encounters where his performance fell short of expectations. Number 8. Jaghatai Khan, the Warhawk whose speed was unmatched. Jaghatai Khan, the Primarch of the 5th Legion, the White Scars, is the Primarch that everyone underestimates, and that underestimation is itself one of his greatest advantages. Throughout the Great Crusade, the Khan was dismissed by many of his brothers as a barbarian, an unsophisticated warlord from a backwater planet who was more comfortable on horseback than in a war council. This perception was catastrophically wrong, and those who held it learned their error at the cost of blood and territory. The Khan landed on the world of Mundus Planus, known to its inhabitants as Chagoris, a planet of vast steppes and warring tribes that bore a striking resemblance to the plains of ancient Mongolia on Old Terra. He was raised among nomadic warriors who valued speed, horsemanship, and the ability to strike without warning and vanish before the enemy could respond. These values became the foundation of his entire approach to warfare, and when he took command of the White Scars, he transformed them into the fastest and most mobile fighting force in the entire Imperium. But the Khan was far more than a cavalry commander on a cosmic scale. He was also an accomplished swordsman, ranked alongside Fulgrim as one of the finest blade fighters among the Primarchs. His style was the opposite of Fulgrim's, however, where the Phoenician favored elegance and precision. The Khan fought with explosive speed and overwhelming momentum, delivering storms of blows so rapid that even superhuman opponents struggled to track his movements. He fought like the wind itself, unpredictable and impossible to contain. The Khan's most significant combat feats occurred during the Siege of Terra, where he proved himself to be far more than the peripheral figure that many had assumed him to be. When the traitor forces seized the Lion's Gate spaceport, a critical strategic position, the Khan personally led the counterattack to retake it. This brought him into direct confrontation with Daemon Mortarion, the Death Guard Primarch, who had been enhanced to monstrous proportions by the power of Nurgle. Their fight was extraordinary. Mortarion, swollen with demonic power, initially dominated the engagement, his enhanced strength and supernatural endurance allowing him to shrug off blows that would have felled mortal warriors. Shom the Khan was beaten down, driven to his knees, and appeared to be on the verge of death. But in that moment of apparent defeat, the Khan found a weapon that transcended the physical. He spoke to Mortarion's pride, taunting the Death Lord for becoming the very thing he had always despised, a slave to the warp and its dark masters. Mortarion, whose hatred for psychers and sorcery had been the defining trait of his entire existence, was enraged by this accusation. And in his rage, he became sloppy. And the Khan seized the opening and launched a counterattack of such ferocity and speed that Demon Mortarion was overwhelmed and driven back. A mortal Primarch, without any demonic enhancement or psychic powers, defeated a demon prince through sheer skill, speed, and psychological warfare. This is one of the most impressive combat feats in the entire Horus Heresy series, and it single-handedly places the Khan above several Primarchs, who might otherwise outrank him. After the heresy, the Khan continued to fight for another 70 years before vanishing through a webway gate while pursuing Dark Eldar raiders. He has not been seen since, but the White Scars believe he is still alive somewhere in the labyrinthine corridors of the webway, still hunting, still fighting, still moving too fast for anything to catch him. If and when the Khan returns, his reappearance could shift the balance of power in the Imperium significantly. The Warhawk sits at number 8 because his mortal form, despite its extraordinary combat achievements, lacks the warp-enhanced power of the demon Primarchs above him and the unique supernatural abilities of certain brothers who rank higher. But make no mistake, in terms of pure martial skill and fighting spirit, Jaghatai Khan is a force that even the mightiest Primarchs respect. Number 7. Vulcan. The immortal flame who cannot truly die. Vulcan, the Primarch of the 18th Legion, The salamanders, possesses something that no other Primarch can claim with certainty. He cannot be killed. Not permanently, at any rate. Vulcan is a perpetual, a being with a unique connection to the fundamental fabric of reality that allows him to regenerate from virtually any injury, including death itself. He has been killed multiple times across the lore and has come back every single time, his body reconstituting itself from even the most catastrophic damage. This single ability, at the sheer impossibility of permanently destroying him, makes Vulcan one of the most powerful beings in the entire Warhammer universe, regardless of any other consideration. But Vulcan is far more than just a being who refuses to stay dead. In terms of raw physical strength, he was consistently ranked as one of the 2 or 3 most physically powerful Primarchs, rivaling even the legendary Ferrus Manus in sheer muscle power. He was enormous, standing taller and broader than most of his brothers, a towering figure of dark skin and blazing eyes who radiated heat like a furnace. On his homeworld of Nocturne, a planet of constant volcanic activity and extreme environmental hazards, Vulcan grew up enduring conditions that would have killed most living beings. He carried a giant salamander, one of the great fire-breathing beasts of Nocturne, in one hand, while clinging to a cliff ledge with the other for 8 straight days, with a river of lava flowing mere feet below him. He breathed in volcanic fumes that would have dissolved the lungs of a normal human, and emerged stronger for the experience. In combat, Vulcan fought with the heavy, devastating style you might expect from a being of his size and strength. He wielded a great warhammer that could crush ceramite armor like eggshell, and he was known for his ability to simply overpower opponents through brute force. During the drop site massacre, Vulcan was one of the 3 loyalist Primarchs who led the initial assault, and even in the chaos of that devastating betrayal, he fought with a ferocity that earned the respect and fear of every warrior on the field. Vulcan's most harrowing ordeal came at the hands of Conrad Kersey, who captured the Salamander's Primarch and subjected him to a prolonged campaign of torture and murder that lasted for an indeterminate period. Kersey killed Vulcan repeatedly, attesting the limits of his perpetual nature with increasingly creative and horrific methods of execution. Vulcan always came back, but the psychological damage was profound. Each death and resurrection took a toll on his mind, pushing him closer and closer to insanity. The fact that he eventually recovered his sanity and his sense of purpose after this ordeal is itself a testament to his extraordinary resilience, both physical and mental. And, in addition to his combat abilities and his perpetual nature, Vulcan was also one of the finest craftsmen among the Primarchs, rivaling Ferrus Manus in his ability to forge weapons and armor of extraordinary quality. He created a collection of legendary artifacts known as the Artifacts of Vulcan, each one a master-crafted weapon of devastating power. These include items like the Spear of Vulcan and the Gauntlet of the Forge, which are among the most powerful individual weapons in the Imperium's arsenal. Vulcan's current status is listed as missing. He vanished from the Imperium at some point after the heresy, and his exact whereabouts are unknown. But given his perpetual nature, it is virtually certain that he is still alive somewhere, waiting for the moment when the Imperium needs him most. The Salamanders believe he will return when they have gathered all of his scattered artifacts, and the anticipation of that return is one of the most persistent hopes in the grimdark future. What keeps Vulcan at number 7 rather than higher is a question of combat finesse rather than raw power. While his physical strength and immortality are extraordinary, his fighting style was not as refined as some of the upper-tier combatants. He relied heavily on overwhelming force, which was devastatingly effective against most opponents, but could be exploited by faster, more technically skilled fighters. Conrad Kersey, despite being physically weaker, was able to repeatedly defeat and kill Vulcan through superior speed and cunning, though admittedly Vulcan always came back. In a universe where permanent death is the standard measure of defeat, Vulcan's inability to stay dead transforms every fight into a war of attrition that he will inevitably win. but against the very strongest Primarchs, those who combine raw power with supernatural abilities and extraordinary martial skill, Vulcan's advantages are less decisive. Number 6. Leman Russ, the Wolf King, whose howl shook the stars. Leman Russ, the Primarch of the 6th Legion, the Space Wolves, was the Emperor's executioner, a title that tells you everything you need to know about his intended role among the Brotherhood. When one of the Emperor's sons strayed too far from the path, when a Primarch needed to be brought to heel or put down entirely, it was Leman Russ who was sent to do the job. This was not a ceremonial position. It was a practical acknowledgement that Russ was one of the most dangerous individual combatants among all the Primarchs, a being whose ferocity in battle was matched only by his deep, unshakable loyalty to the Emperor. Russ landed on Fenris, one of the most hostile death worlds in the galaxy, a planet of perpetual winter, towering glaciers, and predatory megafauna that made even the great beasts of other death worlds look like domestic pets. He was raised first by a Fenrisian thunderwolf, a massive predatory canine, and later by King Thengir of the Russ tribe. This upbringing gave him a fighting style that was unique among the Primarchs, a blend of the feral, instinct-driven combat of a wild predator and the disciplined martial skill of a human warrior. He fought with Mjolnir, a legendary power sword, and the Axe of Hellwinter, and a frost axe imbued with psychic cold, and he was accompanied in battle by his 2 Fenrisian wolves, Freki and Geri, who were themselves formidable combatants. Russ's combat record is extensive and, honestly, a bit more complicated than his reputation might suggest. He was genuinely one of the most feared fighters among the Primarchs, but his actual win-loss record in duels with his brothers is more mixed than you might expect. Against Angron during the Night of the Wolf, Russ was defeated in personal combat, with Angron beating him bloody in a straight fight. However, Russ argued that he had won the larger engagement, because while Angron was lost in his bloodlust and surrounded by space wolves who could have killed him at any moment, Russ had maintained tactical awareness of the broader battlefield. It was a lesson about the difference between winning a fight and winning a war, and it was a lesson that Angron characteristically failed to learn. Against Magnus the Red during the burning of Prospero, Russ fought a legendary duel that saw both Primarchs inflict devastating injuries on each other. Magnus tore a hole straight through Russ's chest with psychic power, a wound so severe that it nearly killed the Wolf King outright. But Russ fought on, eventually breaking Magnus's back and defeating him, though Magnus was able to escape into the warp before being killed. Russ's most impressive combat feat came during his confrontation with Horus himself, after the War Master had been empowered by Chaos following his sojourn on the planet Molech. This was not the fully empowered Siege of Terra Horus, but it was a Horus far beyond his mortal capabilities, charged with warp energy and possessing sorcerous powers that should have made him virtually invincible. Russ fought Horus to something approaching a standstill, and he wielded the Spear of Russ, a weapon specifically designed to counter Chaos corruption, to pierce the War Master's side and temporarily cleanse him of the Dark God's influence. For a brief moment, the real Horus Lupercal stood before Russ, freed from the corruption that had consumed him. But Horus rejected Russ's offer of redemption, and the battle resumed. Ultimately, Horus defeated Russ, wounding him so severely that the Wolf King was a non-factor for the remainder of the war. But the fact that Russ had come that close to turning Horus back from the path of damnation had actually managed to hurt a Chaos-empowered War Master badly enough to strip away his protection was a feat of staggering proportions. Beyond his martial abilities, Russ also possessed a unique psychic gift that he would never have acknowledged as such. His howl, a psychic attack that manifested as a devastating shockwave of sound and warp energy, while it was powerful enough to shatter glass across entire cities and cause nosebleeds and disorientation in powerful psykers like Arzek Ahriman. He could communicate with wolves on a level that went beyond mere animal empathy, and his presence generated an aura that could force even powerful beings to their knees. After the heresy, Russ eventually disappeared into the Eye of Terror with his Varagir bodyguard, promising to return during the prophesied apocalypse known as the Wolf Time. But his current status and location are unknown, but the Space Wolves have never stopped waiting for their king to come home. Russ sits at number 6 because his combination of raw fighting ability, psychic gifts, and legendary feats places him firmly among the elite. But several Primarchs above him possess advantages that he cannot quite match, whether in terms of supernatural power, precognitive ability, or sheer destructive potential. There is a duality to Leman Russ that is easy to miss if you only look at the surface. On the outside, he was the barbarian king, the wild wolf who drank and brawled and charged into battle with a howl that could shatter stone. But underneath that carefully cultivated exterior was something much more complex. Russ was one of the most perceptive of the Primarchs, keenly aware of his brother's strengths and weaknesses, and he understood the political dynamics of the imperial court far better than most people gave him credit for. His barbarian persona was, in many ways, a deliberate performance, a mask that allowed him to operate beneath the notice of brothers who might otherwise have seen him as a threat. His role as the Emperor's executioner was not given lightly. It required not just the ability to kill a Primarch, but the willingness to do so, and more importantly, the judgment to know when the killing was necessary and when a lesser intervention might suffice. Russ carried this burden for the entire Great Crusade, knowing that at any moment he might be called upon to destroy one of his own brothers. It was a lonely and terrible responsibility, and it shaped him in ways that go beyond simple combat ability. The fact that Russ chose to spare Angron during the Night of the Wolf, recognizing that the lesson he was trying to teach was more important than the fight itself, demonstrates a level of strategic thinking that belies his reputation as a mere berserker. And the fact that he chose to try to save Horus rather than simply kill him during their confrontation shows that even the Emperor's executioner had a heart beating beneath all that armor. It cost him dearly, that moment of mercy. But it revealed something about the nature of true strength that goes beyond how hard you can hit. Number 5. Angron, the Red Angel whose rage burns worlds. Angron, the Primarch of the 12th Legion, the World Eaters, is rage made flesh. He is the embodiment of a very specific and terrifying kind of power, the power of violence distilled to its purest, most undiluted form. In the entire history of the Primarchs, no brother was more devastating in close combat, more utterly committed to the act of killing, or more terrifying to face across a battlefield. Angron did not fight to win. He fought to destroy. There is a difference, and it is measured in the amount of blood left on the ground when the fighting is done. The tragedy of Angron begins on the world of Nuceria, where the infant Primarch fell from the sky and into the hands of slavers who recognized his value as a gladiator. They implanted him with the butcher's nails, crude cortical devices that stimulated the aggression centers of his brain while simultaneously dulling his ability to feel any emotion other than rage. The nails were a death sentence. They were slowly killing Angron from the moment they were installed, eating away at his brain and replacing everything that might have made him a balanced, thoughtful leader with nothing but the blind, screaming need to kill. As a gladiator in the fighting pits of Nuceria, Angron killed everything that was put in front of him. He was so dangerous that the rulers of Nuceria could not simply control him through the nails alone. They had to constantly devise new opponents, new challenges, new ways to feed his insatiable appetite for violence. He killed other gladiators. He killed beasts. He killed so many and so often that his name became a byword for unstoppable savagery. And when he finally led a revolt against his masters, standing shoulder to shoulder with his fellow gladiators against the armies of the ruling class, the Emperor himself came to Nuceria. But the Emperor did not save Angron's friends. He did not join the revolt or help the gladiators win their freedom. He plucked Angron from the battlefield against his will and teleported him aboard his ship, leaving the gladiators to be slaughtered by the armies they had been fighting. Angron never forgave this, when he never forgave the Emperor for denying him the right to die alongside his brothers. And that unhealed wound, combined with the constant, agonizing stimulation of the butcher's nails, made Angron the most volatile and unstable of all the Primarchs. In terms of raw combat ability, Angron was terrifying. He was not the most skilled fighter among the Primarchs. His technique was crude, driven by rage rather than discipline, but his speed was extraordinary, far greater than you might expect from a being fueled primarily by fury, and his strength was among the highest of all the brothers. The combination of blinding speed, tremendous physical power, and absolute fearlessness made him arguably the most dangerous opponent in a straight fight, because Angron did not care about defense. He did not block. He did not parry. He simply attacked, faster and harder, and with more devastating force than his opponent could handle. Yes, accepting whatever injuries he sustained in order to deliver killing blows. During the Night of the Wolf, Angron defeated Leman Russ in single combat, beating the Emperor's executioner bloody in a fight that saw both Primarchs push each other to their limits. Russ argued that he had won the strategic engagement, but there was no denying that, in the actual fight, Angron had been the superior combatant. He fought Reboot Guilliman and Lorgar simultaneously during the Shadow Crusade, and while Guilliman was a capable fighter, Angron's fury was simply too much for the Ultramarines Primarch to handle. After his fall to chaos, Angron was elevated to Demon Prince of Khorne through a sorcerous ritual performed by Lorgar on the plains of Nuceria. In his demon form, Angron became something almost beyond comprehension, a being of pure violence, standing dozens of feet tall, armed with a demon-possessed chain axe and a burning sword. He had his body wreathed in the flames of Khorne's eternal rage. Daemon Angron was capable of taking on titans in single combat, a feat that speaks to his absolutely staggering level of physical power. But there is a ceiling to Angron's power, and it is imposed by the very thing that makes him so dangerous. The Butcher's Nails, even in their demon-enhanced form, rob Angron of tactical flexibility. He cannot think beyond the next kill. He cannot strategize beyond the next charge. He is a weapon of mass destruction, with no guidance system, capable of annihilating anything in his path, but unable to adapt to opponents who can find ways to avoid that path. Perturabo exploited this weakness to defeat Demon Angron during the events of Slaves to Darkness, using tactical intelligence and positioning to overcome Angron's raw power. The Red Angel burns at number 5, a being of such devastating combat potential that few in the galaxy can stand before him and survive. But limited by a mind that was broken before it ever had a chance to become whole. What makes Angron genuinely tragic, beyond the obvious horror of his circumstances, is the glimpses of what he might have been. Before the Butcher's Nails consumed everything else, there were moments where Angron showed a different side. He remembered the names of his gladiator companions, every single one of them, and he mourned them with a grief so deep it was almost paralyzing. He cared about those who suffered alongside him. He understood injustice and oppression in a way that was visceral and personal, not abstract. If the nails had never been implanted, if the Emperor had saved his friends on Nuceria instead of abandoning them, Angron might have been one of the most compassionate Primarchs, a champion of the downtrodden and the enslaved, a liberator who fought not for glory, but for the freedom of those too weak to free themselves. Instead, we got the Red Angel, a being who can take on titans in single combat, but cannot remember why he started fighting. A demon prince of the blood god who rages across the galaxy, leaving nothing but ashes and bone in his wake. Not because he wants to, but because he literally cannot stop. The nails took everything from Angron except his ability to kill, and Khorne took what was left and turned it into an engine of infinite violence. In the current era, Daemon Angron remains one of the most active threats in the galaxy, or he has manifested on the world of Armageddon multiple times, each appearance requiring the deployment of massive Imperial forces to banish him back to the warp. His most recent activities have put him into direct confrontation with the forces of the Imperium, in ways that suggest the Blood God is not content to merely let his champion rage in the Eye of Terror. Angron is being pointed at the Imperium like a weapon, and the devastation he brings with each appearance is measured not in casualties, but in entire worlds consumed. Number 4. Lionel Johnson, the first and the last, the Lord of Caliban. Lionel Johnson, the Primarch of the First Legion, the Dark Angels, occupies a peculiar position in the mythology of the Primarchs. He was the first to be created by the Emperor, which gives him a certain primordial quality that sets him apart from his brothers. And yet, for much of the heresy and the Great Crusade, he operated in relative obscurity compared to the more flamboyant or politically prominent brothers. The Lion was not interested in glory or recognition. He was interested in one thing only: killing the enemies of humanity. And at that singular task, he was among the very finest who ever lived. The Lion landed on the death world of Caliban, a planet cloaked in dense, monster-haunted forests, where survival was a daily struggle against creatures of terrible power. Unlike most of his brothers, who were found and raised by human communities, the infant Lion spent an unknown period of time alone in the forests, surviving entirely on his own. The exact duration of this solitary childhood is unclear, but the fact that he survived at all, on a world where the local megafauna could challenge even armed and armored warriors, speaks to an extraordinary level of innate combat ability. As a child, before he had any training, but before he even understood the concepts of swordsmanship or martial discipline, the young Lion killed a Calibanite lion with his bare hands. These were not the lions of ancient terror. Calibanite lions were massive, warp-touched predatory beasts that even groups of trained knights struggled to bring down. A child, alone, with nothing but his hands and his instincts, killed one of these creatures, and it was the first of many feats that would establish the Lion as one of the most naturally gifted warriors the galaxy had ever produced. Under the tutelage of Luther and the Order of Caliban, the Lion refined his raw talent into a fighting style that was as devastating as it was economical. He did not waste movements. He did not indulge in the theatrical flourishes that characterized fighters like Fulgrim. Every strike, every parry, and every shift of his weight was designed to achieve a single purpose: the most efficient possible elimination of the enemy in front of him. This cold, relentless approach to combat made the Lion terrifying to face, because unlike berserkers who could be goaded into mistakes, or duelists who might overcommit to an elegant combination, the Lion simply killed, methodically, relentlessly, and without hesitation. The Lion's combat feats during the heresy are extensive and consistently impressive, as he fought Conrad Kurz on multiple occasions. And while their encounters were brutal and both combatants took serious injuries, the Lion eventually defeated Kurzi in single combat, breaking the Night Haunter's spine over his knee in a display of raw physical dominance that shocked even his own legionaries. He knocked Leman Russ unconscious with a single punch during a dispute, a feat that is frequently cited as evidence of the Lion's extraordinary striking power, and given how notoriously tough Russ was. In the current era of the 41st millennium, the Lion has returned. After sleeping for 10,000 years in the hidden depths of the rock, the Dark Angel's fortress monastery, he has awakened and re-entered the galaxy's wars. And the version of the Lion that has returned may be more powerful than the one who went to sleep. He now wields the Emperor's shield, a relic of devastating power that can reflect any attack thrown at it and has been shown capable of erasing warp-spawned creatures from existence. He has also demonstrated the ability known as forest walking, a form of dimensional travel that allows him to step between reality and a shadow realm that mirrors his lost homeworld of Caliban. These new abilities, combined with his already legendary martial skill, make the returned Lion one of the most individually powerful beings currently active in the Warhammer universe. He can step through dimensions to avoid attacks or reposition himself. He can erase demons with a shield that turns their own power against them. And he fights with the accumulated experience of a warrior who was already among the finest in the galaxy before taking a 10,000-year nap. The Lion sits at number 4 because his combination of supreme martial skill, supernatural abilities, and powerful war gear places him comfortably among the elite. But the 3 Primarchs above him possess advantages that even the Lord of Caliban cannot quite match. Number 3. Magnus the Red. The Crimson King. whose mind could shake the stars. Magnus the Red, the Primarch of the 15th Legion, the Thousand Sons, was not the strongest Primarch in terms of physical combat. He was not the fastest, the toughest, or the most skilled with a blade. In a straight fight, but with all psychic powers removed and only physical attributes to rely upon, Magnus would have fallen comfortably into the middle of the pack. He was large, standing taller than most of his brothers, and his physical strength was considerable. But when the swords came out and the fighting started, he simply did not possess the martial refinement of brothers like the Lion, Sanguinius, or Fulgrim. But psychic powers cannot be removed from a discussion of Magnus. They are the essence of who he is. And in the realm of psychic might, Magnus the Red was second only to the Emperor himself. Let that statement settle for a moment. Of all the beings in the Milky Way galaxy, across trillions of humans and countless alien species, Magnus was the single most powerful psyker after his father. The gap between Magnus and any other psyker in the galaxy, excluding the Emperor, was the gap between a sun and a candle. Magnus landed on the world of Prospero, in a planet where psychic mutation was common and the study of the warp was practiced openly. He grew to become the planet's ruler and its greatest scholar, compiling the legendary Book of Magnus, a vast compendium of psychic knowledge gathered from cultures across the galaxy. He established the cults of the Thousand Sons, each one dedicated to studying a different aspect of psychic power, from telepathy and telekinesis to biomancy and pyromancy. Under his guidance, the Thousand Sons became the most psychically powerful fighting force in the Imperium, warriors who could reshape reality on the battlefield as easily as they could fire a bolter. The scope of Magnus's psychic abilities is genuinely difficult to comprehend. He could project his consciousness across the entire galaxy, communicating telepathically with the Emperor from the far side of the cosmos. He could tear open holes in the fabric of reality, reaching through the warp to physically affect locations thousands of light years away. During the events that precipitated the burning of Prospero, Magnus projected himself psychically through the warp and breached the Emperor's secret webway project on Terra, an act of such immense power that it damaged the carefully constructed psychic wards protecting the Imperial throne and allowed demonic forces to pour through the breach. It was catastrophic and unintended, but the sheer power required to accomplish it, even accidentally, was beyond anything any other Primarch could have achieved. In combat, Magnus's psychic abilities made him phenomenally dangerous. He could tear apart tanks and titans with telekinetic force. He could flay the minds of his enemies, reducing hardened warriors to screaming wrecks with a thought. He could manipulate fire, lightning, and raw warp energy as weapons, hurling them at his opponents with a precision and destructive force that rivaled conventional artillery. During his duel with Leman Russ on Prospero, Magnus tore a hole straight through the Wolf King's chest with psychic power, a wound so severe that it nearly killed one of the most physically resilient Primarchs in existence. And this was before his ascension to demonhood. After falling to chaos and being elevated to Demon Prince of Sinch, the god of change and sorcery, Magnus's already staggering psychic abilities were amplified to an extent that defies reasonable description. As a Daemon Prince, Magnus exists partially outside normal reality, a being of such immense psychic presence that his very appearance on a battlefield can destabilize the fabric of the materium. He can create illusions so convincing that they become functionally real. He can manipulate time and space on a local scale. He can summon legions of demons and direct them with the precision of a master conductor leading an orchestra of destruction. During the current era, Demon Magnus launched an invasion of the Fenris system, striking at the heart of the Space Wolves' homeworld in an act of revenge for the burning of Prospero. The devastation he wrought was extraordinary, and it took the combined efforts of the Space Wolves, the Grey Knights, and a host of Imperial forces to drive him back. When Robut Guilliman confronted Magnus after his resurrection, the Demon Primarch's psychic might proved overwhelming, and Guilliman was only able to survive the encounter thanks to the Emperor's sword and the intervention of external forces. Magnus sits at number 3 because psychic power, at the level he wields it, is the single most versatile and devastating form of combat ability in the Warhammer universe. He can kill you from across the galaxy. He can unmake reality around you. He can turn your own mind into a weapon against you. In terms of the sheer breadth and depth of what he can do, Magnus has no equal among the Primarchs. The only reasons he does not sit higher are the 2 brothers above him, who possess their own extraordinary advantages that offset even the Crimson King's godlike psychic might. Number 2. Sanguinius, the angel whose wings carried the weight of prophecy. Sanguinius, the Primarch of the 9th Legion, the Blood Angels. Was everything a Primarch was supposed to be. He was beautiful, noble, brave, compassionate, and possessed of a warrior's skill that placed him at the absolute peak of what the Emperor's genetic mastery could produce. Among the loyalist Primarchs, he was almost universally regarded as the finest, a being whose combination of physical ability, preternatural grace, and supernatural gifts made him arguably the most complete warrior in the entire Brotherhood. The most immediately striking thing about Sanguinius was, of course, his wings. Great, white-feathered wings that sprouted from his back and granted him true flight, the ability to soar above the battlefield and descend upon his enemies like an avenging angel from the religious myths of old terror. These were not mechanical additions or warp-derived mutations. They were part of his genetic design, though the Emperor had not intended them. They were a deviation, a flaw in the Primarch template, and they were beautiful. Sanguinius landed on the radioactive moon of Baal Secundus, a harsh world of mutants and scavengers where survival was a daily struggle against both the irradiated environment and the warped creatures that inhabited it. Even as an infant, Sanguinius displayed abilities that set him apart from other Primarchs. His wings manifested early, and with them came an aura of beauty and charisma that drew people to him like moths to a golden flame. He was adopted by a tribe called the Blood, who saw in him the living incarnation of their ancient messianic prophecies. He led them to dominance over the other tribes and brought a measure of civilization to a world that had known only savagery. In combat, Sanguinius was breathtaking. He fought with a spear called the Blade in Carmine and a sword of the same name, weapons that became extensions of his body so completely that it was impossible to tell where the Primarch ended and the weapon began. His fighting style combined the aerial mobility granted by his wings with a ground fighting capability that was the equal of any Primarch alive. He could dive from the sky at incredible speed, striking with the force of a thunderbolt, and then transition seamlessly into a ground duel of such speed and precision that even the finest swordsmen among his brothers were hard-pressed to keep pace. The evidence for Sanguinius's supreme combat ability is extensive and consistent. He fought Kabanda, one of the most powerful bloodthirsters of Horn, a greater demon of such immense power that it could challenge armies single-handedly. Sanguinius defeated Kabanda, banishing the daemon back to the warp despite suffering serious injuries in the process. This was not a minor accomplishment. Bloodthirsters are among the most physically powerful beings in the Warhammer universe, embodiments of Khorne's rage given demonic form, and defeating one in single combat is a feat reserved for the very mightiest warriors. He also fought a Keeper of Secrets, a greater demon of Slanesh, and banished it as well. 2 greater daemons, 2 different chaos gods, both defeated by a single Primarch. The lore also tells us that he fought Conrad Curzay to a standstill, their precognitive abilities cancelling each other out in a fight where neither could gain a decisive advantage. And during the Siege of Terror, Sanguinius was everywhere. The fighting was thickest, his golden armor and white wings visible above the carnage as he struck down traitors by the hundreds. But Sanguinius's most famous feat was also his last. At the climax of the Siege of Terror, when the Emperor launched his final desperate assault on Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, Sanguinius was the first to reach the War Master. By this point, Horus had been fully empowered by all 4 Chaos Gods simultaneously, making him arguably the most powerful mortal being in the galaxy after the Emperor himself. Sanguinius, already exhausted and injured from days of continuous fighting during the defense of the Eternity Gate, faced Horus alone in the corrupted heart of the flagship. Had he knew he was going to die, his precognitive visions had shown him this moment countless times, the angel falling before the War Master in the darkness of his court. He knew that he could not win, but he fought anyway, because that was who he was. The details of their battle vary between sources, but what is consistent is that Sanguinius fought Horus with everything he had, that he managed to land a blow that cracked the War Master's armor and created a chink that the Emperor would later exploit, and that he died. Horus killed Sanguinius, and the angel's death sent a psychic shockwave through the Blood Angels that created the genetic curse known as the Black Rage, a flaw that would haunt the chapter for 10,000 years. The Black Rage is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it speaks to the scale of Sanguinius's psychic presence. When he died, the psychic echo of his final moments was so powerful that it imprinted itself into the genetic code of every Blood Angel who would ever live. 10,000 years later, Blood Angels still experience visions of Sanguinius's last battle, reliving his final moments with such intensity that they lose themselves in the hallucination and become unstoppable berserkers who believe they are the angel himself, fighting Horus on the vengeful spirit. And a being whose death can echo through genetics for 10,000 years, whose final moments of agony and defiance can reshape the very DNA of an entire chapter of Space Marines. That is not merely a powerful warrior. That is something approaching a force of nature. It is also worth noting the response that Sanguinius inspired in those around him. He was universally beloved among the Primarchs, an achievement that is frankly astonishing given how many of his brothers were consumed by jealousy, or rivalry, and suspicion. Even traitor Primarchs like Horus seemed to feel genuine affection for Sanguinius, which is why the War Master's offer for the angel to join him in rebellion was not a cynical ploy, but a sincere, if twisted, expression of the bond between them. Guilliman respected him so much that he named Sanguinius as the replacement emperor during the Imperium Secundus. The Khan, who kept most of his brothers at arm's length, openly admired him. Even the dour and suspicious lion acknowledged his worth. This universal admiration was not merely the result of Sanguinius's beauty or charisma, though both were extraordinary. It was because Sanguinius embodied the ideal that every Primarch was supposed to represent. He was noble without being arrogant. He was powerful without being cruel. He was aware of his flaws, including the red thirst that lurked in his genetic code like a time bomb. And he bore that knowledge with quiet dignity rather than denial or despair. He was everything the Emperor had hoped his sons would be, and his death at the hands of the brother who had fallen furthest was the cruelest possible commentary on the fate of those hopes. But here is what matters for our ranking. Sanguinius fought a being empowered by 4 chaos gods simultaneously, a being that would soon go on to nearly kill the Emperor himself, and he landed a blow. Yet he cracked the armor of a being of near godlike power while running on nothing but courage and the last fumes of his strength. That is extraordinary. That places him in the absolute upper echelon of Primarch power. Many fans and lore enthusiasts believe Sanguinius should be ranked as the single most powerful Primarch, and the argument is strong. In terms of pure combat ability, martial skill, and the quality of his opponents, Sanguinius has arguably the most impressive resume of any Primarch. He sits at number 2 because, in the end, he was still a mortal Primarch facing a being of divine power, and he fell. The one being who outranks him did not merely fight the darkness, he became it. Number 1. Horus Lupercal, the War Master whose power shook the galaxy. And so we arrive at the summit, at the peak of this terrible mountain, where the air is thin with the weight of betrayal and the ground is scorched by the fire of ambition that burned too hot and too long. Horus Lupercal. While the Primarch of the 16th Legion, the Lunar Wolves who became the sons of Horus, was the favorite son, the first found, the most beloved of all the Emperor's children. and he became the most powerful individual being in the mortal galaxy, surpassed only by his father. To understand why Horus sits at number 1, you must understand the trajectory of his power, because unlike any other Primarch, Horus's story is one of escalation so extreme that by the end of it, the word powerful feels inadequate to describe what he had become. In his mortal form, during the Great Crusade, Horus was already among the finest warriors the Emperor's sons had to offer. He was not the absolute peak in any single category. He was not physically the strongest. That was Vulcan or Ferris. He was not the fastest. That was the Khan or Fulgrim. He was not the most psychically gifted. That was Magnus. But Horus was extraordinary across every category simultaneously, yet a generalist of such breathtaking competence that the whole was far greater than the sum of its parts. He fought with a genius-level tactical intellect fused to a street fighter's ruthless pragmatism, the product of growing up in the gang warfare of the mining world Chthoniya. He wielded Worldbreaker, a massive power maul, and the Talon of Horus, a legendary lightning claw with an integrated twin bolter. And he used both with a skill that even his brothers acknowledged as being among the finest in the Brotherhood. The Emperor chose Horus as War Master, not merely because he was his favorite son, but because Horus was the best. He was the most balanced, the most capable of inspiring loyalty, the most adept at reading both military and political situations. He conquered more worlds during the Great Crusade than any other Primarch. And he did so with a combination of military brilliance and personal charisma that made even his enemies respect him. But Horus's pre-fall power, impressive as it was, is not what places him at number 1. What places him at number 1 is what happened after his corruption. On the planet Molech, Horus underwent a transformation that elevated him beyond anything his brothers could match. He entered the Chaos Gate, a portal to the realm of the Dark Gods. And there he communed directly with all 4 Chaos powers. The exact nature of what occurred is shrouded in warp-born mystery, but the result was unmistakable. Horus emerged as something more than a Primarch. He was described as possessing strength and resilience beyond anyone except possibly the Emperor, eclipsing all of his brethren in might and physically towering over them. He had gained access to sorcerous powers of tremendous potency, the ability to perceive and manipulate the warp in ways that rivaled even Magnus, and a physical presence so overwhelming that hardened space marines were driven mad simply by being in the same room as him. Against Leman Russ, the Emperor's executioner, who came armed with a weapon specifically designed to counter chaos corruption, Horus demonstrated his enhanced power by dominating the fight, despite Russ's speed and skill. Even after Russ managed to wound him with the Spear of Russ, or temporarily stripping away his chaos empowerment, Horus rejected the chance for redemption and defeated the Wolf King so thoroughly that Russ was removed from the war entirely. And then, during the Siege of Terra, Horus continued to grow in power. Shut away in the pocket dimension known as Lupercal's court aboard his flagship, Horus absorbed the combined might of all 4 Chaos gods simultaneously. He swelled with so much power that his advisors warned he was being burned out by the sheer volume of energy flowing through him, his mortal body struggling to contain forces that were never meant to be held by a single vessel. But even this self-destructive empowerment served his purpose, because by the time the Emperor came to face him, Horus had achieved a level of power that was genuinely godlike. In the final confrontation, Chaos-empowered Horus displayed feats that defy description. But he broke down the barriers between space and time, causing his flagship and the surface of Terra to overlap. He paused time itself at the moment of their confrontation. The Lupercal's court, the pocket dimension he controlled, became an infinite realm that served as the arena for his battle with the Emperor. A single swing of Worldbreaker was described as generating the force of a supernova. He wrestled with the Emperor of mankind himself, and a being of cosmic psychic power who had created the Primarchs and built an empire spanning the galaxy, and he held his ground. For a time, it seemed as though Horus might actually win. Sanguinius, who had reached Horus first, had already fallen. The angel had fought with everything he had and managed to crack Horus's armor, but in the end, the War Master killed him. The fact that Horus, empowered as he was, can still face genuine resistance from Sanguinius says something about the angel's extraordinary power. But in the end, it was not enough. Horus killed the most beloved of the Primarchs. And when the Emperor finally faced him, the battle that ensued threatened to tear reality apart. The Emperor ultimately destroyed Horus, unleashing his full psychic power to erase the War Master from existence so completely that even the Chaos Gods could not bring him back. But the price of that victory was effectively everything. The Emperor was mortally wounded, crippled to the point where he had to be interred upon the Golden Throne for 10,000 years of living death. The Imperium was shattered. The dream of a golden age for humanity was destroyed forever. No other Primarch forced the Emperor to pay that price. No other being in the entire history of the Warhammer universe, mortal or immortal, came that close to overthrowing the master of mankind. Horus Lupercal, at the peak of his chaos-empowered might, was the single most powerful individual to ever stand against the Emperor in the mortal realm. His power was, according to the lore itself, described as infinite. He was a proto-chaos god, a being on the cusp of ascending to a level of existence that would have placed him among the ruinous powers themselves. There is a reading of the final battle that suggests Horus was not merely winning against the Emperor, but actively transcending the boundaries of what any mortal being had ever been. The Lupercal's court had become a realm unto itself, an infinite dimension where the rules of reality were whatever Horus willed them to be. Within that space, he was effectively omnipotent, a being whose power grew with every moment as the four Chaos Gods poured more and more of their essence into him. The Emperor, for all his cosmic might, was fighting not just Horus, but the concentrated will of four divine beings channeled through a single, devastatingly powerful vessel. Some scholars of the lore argue that the Emperor could have defeated Horus at any point during the battle if he had been willing to unleash his full power from the start. They suggest that the Emperor held back because he was still trying to save his son, still hoping that somewhere within the mountain of chaos-fueled power there remained a spark of the Horus he had loved. This interpretation is supported by certain accounts that describe the Emperor attempting to reach Horus through the corruption, trying to find the real son buried beneath the dark god's influence. If this is true, then Horus's power is even more impressive, because it means the Emperor, the most powerful psychic being in human history, could not find a way through Horus's defenses to reach the mortal man within. The corruption was total. The possession was complete. There was nothing left to save. And when the Emperor finally accepted this, when he unleashed his full power and obliterated Horus from existence, the effort cost him everything. He had to burn through his own life force to generate the power necessary to destroy a being who had, in those final moments, become something approaching a god. That is the measure of Horus Lupercal's power. Not just that he was strong enough to nearly kill the Emperor, but that he was so thoroughly saturated with the power of chaos that the Emperor had to sacrifice himself to stop him. The Golden Throne, the Astronomicon, the slow decay of the Imperium over 10,000 years. All of it, every bit of the suffering that has defined the 41st millennium, can be traced back to the power that Horus wielded in those final moments aboard the Vengeful Spirit. And that is why he sits at number 1. Not because he was the best swordsman, or the strongest in body, or the most psychically gifted, but because when the four Chaos Gods poured their combined might into a single vessel, Horus Lupercal was the vessel that could hold it. He was the weapon that nearly broke the galaxy, the son who nearly killed the father, the War Master who came within a hair's breadth of ending 10,000 years of human civilization before it even properly began. Well, his power was borrowed, yes. It was fueled by dark gods who were using him as a puppet, even as he believed he was using them. And in the end, it destroyed him as surely as it destroyed the father he had turned against. But in that brief, terrible moment at the summit of the Siege of Terror, Horus Lupercal was the most powerful mortal being in the galaxy, and the shadow of that power still falls across the Imperium 10,000 years later. The War Master is dead. But the wound he left in the heart of humanity will never fully heal. There is a lesson in Horus's story that goes beyond the ranking of power levels, and it is this. The most dangerous power is not the power of the sword, or the mind, or the warp. It is the power of trust, betrayed. Horus was able to nearly destroy the Imperium not because he was the strongest Primarch, though at his peak he certainly was, but because the Emperor trusted him completely, because his brothers loved him, or because the entire Imperium looked to him as the embodiment of humanity's highest potential. When Horus fell, he did not merely take an army with him. He took the galaxy's belief in itself, its conviction that the future could be bright, that the darkness could be held at bay, that the sons of the Emperor could be better than the forces that sought to destroy them. That betrayal, more than any weapon or psychic blast or demonic transformation, is what truly broke the Imperium. And it is why, 10,000 years later, the galaxy is still drowning in the aftermath of one man's fall from grace. And there you have it. Every known Primarch, ranked from the golden-tongued preacher who knelt before dark gods to the War Master who nearly tore the galaxy in half. 20 sons of the Emperor, each one a masterwork of genetic engineering and cosmic ambition, each one carrying the weight of a destiny that would reshape the stars. Some found glory, some found damnation, and some found both, often in the same breath. It is worth pausing for a moment to appreciate just how remarkable these beings are, not just as characters in a fictional setting, but as embodiments of different types of strength and different approaches to power. Lorgar reminds us that the pen can be mightier than the sword, even if the sword still wins the immediate fight. Alpharius and Omegon remind us that intelligence and deception are forms of power that should never be underestimated. Vulcan reminds us that the truest strength is the kind that endures, that keeps getting back up no matter how many times it is knocked down. Sanguinius reminds us that courage in the face of certain death is the highest expression of the warrior's spirit. And Horus reminds us that the greatest power of all is the power to choose, and that the wrong choice, made at the wrong moment, can echo through eternity. These are not just warriors, they are archetypes, or reflections of the different faces of human ambition, human tragedy, and human potential. They are mirrors in which we see our own strengths and weaknesses magnified to cosmic proportions. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is why we keep coming back to their stories, decade after decade, book after book, conversation after conversation. What do you think? Would you rearrange this list? Would you place the angel above the War Master? Or would you argue that the Khan's defeat of Demon Mortarion earned him a higher spot, or that Vulcan's immortality makes him the true number one? These are the conversations that make the Warhammer universe so endlessly fascinating, the debates that can last longer than the heresy itself. And I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this journey through the hierarchy of demigods, if the stories of these shattered brothers kept you company through the darkness, then please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to Q on 40,000. Every subscription helps this channel grow, and it means the world to me that you chose to spend your time here, walking through the grim darkness of the far future together. There is so much more lore to explore, so many more stories to tell, and I would love to have you along for all of it. Until next time, stay comfortable, stay curious, and remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But in the spaces between the battles, there are stories worth telling. And those stories are what keep us coming back to this magnificent, terrible, endlessly captivating universe. Peace, and I will see you in the next one.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.